Termo to Madeline, audio edition. Page 30. Jim Looper. Changing horses in the middle of the stream. The South Fork ranchers had a lot to pull on the west side of the Madeline Plains in the 1880s. In those years, men grazed their cattle wherever they wanted, and the one who got there first was the one who got the lion's share of the feed. Most stockmen came into the Tule Lake area in the spring and got out in the fall, ahead of the heavy snows that customarily covered the range. The only ones who really held the edge of the big South Fork stockmen, and still do today, were the locals. They were permanently dug in. They never left their ranches, fed hay in the winter, and had their livestock turned out on the open ranges in the spring before the boys that likely could get through the snow and the mud to get to the plains. The main locals in the 1880s, of course, was Elmer Van Loen, Matt Haley, John Smith, and John Williams. Smith and Williams were fast-paced horse runners who ran their animals where they wanted, when they wanted, and were always there ahead of the South Fork operators. Of course, John Williams operated in partners with his father, which gave him a better chance than the other South Forkers. In those years, long before the Big Four, of which Elmer Van Loen was ever heard of, Van Loen was just getting started and in no way can compete with the massive livestock operators of the South Fork. But he held his own on his own ground and was often there first when a good deal was in the making. And of course he eventually became one of the larger operators in the South Fork Valley itself. Matt Haley, on the other hand, not only held his own with the South Forkers, but he trod on them pretty heavily at times. At one time, George E. Williams and his wife Mary, and their two sons Charlie and Wade, all owed Matt Haley money. Even the great George Bailey was not immune from borrowing money from Matt Haley, and did it more than once. One individual, who at the time was a large operator and wealthier than any of them, was racehorseman Theodore Winters. But he was at a distinct disadvantage in the competition for the feed at Tule Lake. In the end, he received a heavy trouncing from the South Fork stockmen. Well, to begin with, his home was in Washoe Valley, a couple of 100 miles and a week's ride from the Marsh place. His nearest winter range was at Smoke Creek, and again it took a good week to move cattle up to the plains and the 20 miles across the flat in the spring. He could have turned his cattle loose on the east side and slowly worked his way across the Marsh place, but, again, the locals in that area, of which were many, had the advantage of being turned out several weeks before Winters could get his cattle onto the plains. So he contented himself with running a few cattle on his fenced-in Marsh place and using it as a summer pasture for his thoroughbred racehorses. As shrewd a businessman as he was, he could have done better, but his operation was getting too big for any one man to operate, and besides, his main interests were elsewhere. Washoe Valley was his first love, surpassed only by his love of the turf. Still, he could have undoubtedly kept the Marsh place and made a show place out of it, except for two problems. Jim Looper, his foreman, was a very volatile individual, and some of the South Fork boys had their eye on the place. Whether Looper had a falling out with Winters first, or whether South Forkers talked him over to their side first, and then the falling out came, will never be known. At any rate, Looper did change horses in midstream, and George Bailey ended up with the Marsh place. Actually, George Williams owned land adjoining to it on its two sides, and in all probability it was he who really wanted it. It was Bailey, however, who was wealthy and better able to win Looper over. George Bailey and George E. Williams were the best of friends and often operated together. More than likely, it was a partnership arrangement to help Theodore Winters find the way back to Nevada where he belonged. Sometime in the early 80s, Jim Looper quit Theodore Winters and went to work for George Bailey. Since all the Marsh property was still in Looper's name, he having not yet proved up on it, there was nothing for Winters to do but start a fight or get out. He chose the latter, and his livestock were never again seen on the Madeline Plains. Looper received the patent for his lower homestead in 1883 and immediately sold it to George Bailey for $500. The upper piece, where the Williams Ranch horse now stands, was finally proved up on in 1884, and it too went to Bailey for $500. Thus, for a time, the place became Bailey's Marsh Place. Next chapter, titled Poor Old Sam Shaw. Throughout the winter of 1883-1884, a lonely, unfinished cabin stood at the mouth of a small ravine on the west side of the plains, about halfway between Winter's Marsh Place and the Horse Lake to Ash Valley Road. There was no roof on the 14 by 14-foot board structure, and snow whipped into it through the 6-foot wide opening that had been intended for a fireplace, leaving a large drift across the frozen floorboards. A bed frame stood in one corner, the only indication of previous human habitation. A couple of 100 yards below the cabin, a deep-rutted, wind-swept wagon trail cut its way through the ice and frozen mud, up towards the Marsh Place. This constituted the public road between Dry Valley and the South Fork. About the same distance away in the ravine in the west stood 2 large wooden watering troughs. Fresh water was piped into them from a couple of small springs above, but at this time of year the major portion of their contents was ice and drifted snow. These troughs had been put in a couple of years previously by Jim Looper and others of Bailey's hired men for the watering of livestock. In fact, it had been George Bailey's intention to own the land on which the springs and troughs were located. But Looper had missed a section corner somewhere and filed on the adjoining 80 acres, missing the springs entirely. And now claim had been filed by another party, putting the springs in the same parcel of ground as the forlorn, half-finished cabin below. The only other sign of past human activity was a mound of frozen dirt and mud on the hillside, just a few yards south of the cabin. At one end of the mound was a neatly stacked pile of rocks, obviously marking a lonely grave. To the casual passer-by, had there been such a thing in the dead of winter in the Madeline Plains in those years, the scene would have sparked little more in the imagination than the dreary visions of life and death in the harsh, unyielding land. But to anyone in Lassen or Modoc counties, and to many people in northern California, the sight would have caused the hair to stand on the back of the neck and cold chills to run rampant up and down the spine. For that small pile of rocks by the abandoned cabin marked the final resting place of Samuel B. Shaw, recently murdered in ghastly cold blood by an unknown person, still on the loose. A reward of $500 was offered by the Lassen County supervisors for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator of the crime. The governor of the state of California had offered another $300. As a whole, people were up in arms. The Beaver Tribune and the Lassen Advocate editors were charging Lassen County law enforcement officials with negligence and demanding action on their part. The Aden Argus newspaper charged that, quote, "The murder was one of the most cold-blooded on record. Lassen County has heretofore been lax in shifting matters of this kind to the bottom, and we express only the general opinion when we saw that it is extremely doubtful in any systematic attempt to be made by the authorities of Lassen County to bring the murder of Shaw to justice. We are informed on what we consider good authority that certain clues have been discovered which, in skillful hands, might run the murderer to ground," unquote. Actually, the sheriff and his deputies were doing their very best under the circumstances. The clues that everyone was talking about were really just wisps in the wind. The authorities had already taken several dead-end streets. Some time had been spent searching for a young fellow who stopped at the Madeline stage station in Grasshopper about the time of the murder. He had seemed to be excited and was in a terrible hurry. Had the sheriff ever been able to locate him, he would have found a boy who was anxious to get wherever he was going without getting completely drenched in the storm that were soaking in the northern part of the state of late September of 1883. The sheriff had also arrested Jim Looper and transported him to Susanville for questioning. He was, after all, Shaw's closest neighbor, and it was well known in some circles how Looper had received a severe dressing down by George Bailey when it was learned that he had filed on the wrong piece of ground, and Shaw had stepped in and got control of those little springs. But after a long and prying interrogation, Looper had to be released for lack of evidence. Actually, there were those who knew why Sam Shaw had been murdered and who did it, but they were as silent as the corpse had been the day it was discovered. And there were those who thought they knew how, and especially why, Sam Shaw had been killed. They never shut up. The average person was not only wondering why it had happened, but his questioning got right down to very basic. Who was this Sam Shaw, anyway? Answers were few, but rumors was ripe and everywhere to be heard. Only a few people in the area had met Shaw. He was known at Van Loan's because he had spent a few nights there, and he was known by the Williams family. He had been their neighbor in Chico for a number of years, and it was George E. Williams who had told him about the Madeline Plains. In fact, the approximate month that had been at Tule Lake, he had been working as a teamster for John Williams on the public roads. Samuel B. Shaw was an older farmer who had crossed the plains from Tennessee in the early days of the West. He had settled first in Chico. There he joined the newly formed Chico Masonic Lodge on March 25, 1859. He was destined to become one of the most active members of the lodge. He later moved to Shasta County, and there was elected to the office of assessor in the early 60s. He also ran for the office of sheriff there, but was defeated. In the later part of that decade, he moved to Deer Creek in Tehama County. He was only there a short while when he acquired a sizable ranch in Butte County on Rock Creek between Nord and Chico. Shaw remained on his place until 1878 when his wife died. He had several children, but they were all grown. So he sold his ranch to a fellow by the name of Bell and just worked at odd jobs around the country in Tehama and Butte counties. On August 4th, 1883, Sam Shaw left Chico for the last time. He had been told of the Madeline Plains, and evidently decided that it was the place to get away from the hurt of having lost his wife. He had just turned 60, an old man for those years, especially to be starting a new life in the wilderness like Tule Lake. He went first to John Williams' camp and spent the next little while riding around the country in search of a suitable place to take up a piece of land. When he went into the land office in Susanville and learned that Looper had not actually filed on those springs on the west side, he put his claim on them. Back up at Tule Lake, he hired on with Williams to help with the fall road work. He procured some lumber from Elmer Van Loan, and on his spare time began hauling it to his possessor claim on the other side of the flat. By early September, some heavy fall rains had already made a lake out of the flat, so it was necessary for him to make his hauls to the north and around the marsh place. Undoubtedly Looper seethed with anger every time he saw him pass by with a load of lumber, being reminded of his mistake and how unhappy George Bailey had been because of it. Because of the mud and disagreeable weather, and because he could only work on the days he wasn't patching up roads, Shaw's work on the place went slowly. Little by little, however, a cabin began to take shape. Along about the 26th of September, he was back at Van Loan's getting some supplies. Early on the morning of the 29th, he headed back to his place with a team and wagon. He was home in plenty of time to unload the wagon, and the next morning he headed out towards Spooner Place to cut a load of juniper poles to make rafters for his cabin. He was gone all day cutting the poles. While he was on the mountain, he shot a young doe and dressed her out on the wagon. Late in the afternoon, he loaded the poles on the wagon and headed home. Before stopping at his cabin, he drove on south about a mile to where a little band of Indians were camped. He gave them most of the venison he had killed, but didn't stay long to visit, as it was already dark. Back at the place, where he parked a wagon load of poles on the hill above the cabin and unhitched his team of horses. He laid the harness on top of the load of poles just as he started out, leading the horses toward a small enclosure, which he had temporarily fenced off as a wrangle lot. A shadowy figure stepped out of the dark. It appeared to be a tall man, partly because of a large hat he was wearing. The hat had a long feather stuck in the band, and from beneath it flowed an immense amount of long black hair. Even in the dark, the facial features and the dark complexion gave the individual the appearance of a Pit River Indian. The two men spoke, and after words were exchanged,